Well, good afternoon. Thank you everybody for joining us today for our very first webinar on sex equity in athletics since 2019. This is a big day over here, big day. I'm happy to see such a good turnout for the webinar today. A great mix of familiar names and also new names on the participant list. So welcome to everybody. My name is Kasha Rosetta, and I am an attorney and program supervisor in OSPI's Equity and Civil Rights Office. I've been working at OSPI for about 5.5 years, and before that, I was an attorney in private practice, and before that, I was a middle school teacher and athletic director at a small school in Seattle. My colleague, Jeremy Page, is also here today working behind the scenes, running the Q&A during the presentation, and he'll also be moderating the live Q&A at the end. So I wanted to give him a moment to introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Jeremy Page, program supervisor working with Kasha. I'm here to help out, assist with the Q&A, and looking forward to the presentation from Kasha. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. All right, before we get started, just want to acknowledge that the indigenous people of the Stetchas Band of the Squaxin Island tribe who have stewarded the land where we are since time immemorial and who still inhabit the land today. And I also wanted to take just a quick moment to highlight OSPI's vision, mission, and values. And the reason for this is because our topic today, which is sex equity in Washington's K-12 public schools, athletics, really fits neatly into the value that has been intentionally prioritized at our agency, which is ensuring equity, right? Closing opportunity gaps and developing equity-based policies and practices. So I wanted to highlight that part of our agency's mission, vision, and values, and just acknowledge that this presentation fits squarely within that wheelhouse. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our office, we are a small office in the Office of Superintendent for Public Instruction that works to make sure that every student has equal access to their education. We have an intentional focus on prevention. So our goal is to address equity and civil rights issues proactively because we think that's what's best for students and for schools. To that end, we develop civil rights policy, guidance, and tools. We also offer trainings like this one to district and school administrators, and we provide what we call technical assistance to both districts and families alike. And technical assistance is kind of this term of art. We use it to distinguish it from legal advice. So most of us in the office, Equity and Civil Rights Office, are attorneys, but we do not provide legal advice. We are not your attorneys. You have counsel for that. But what we can do when you call our office with a question, we can tell you what law would apply, and we can share with you how that law has been interpreted. What we can't necessarily do is apply your facts to a specific law and provide you advice on what you should do or what the outcome is likely to be. So that's why we call it technical assistance, just to make that distinction. We also connect families with key people in your districts when they need to talk about a civil rights issue. And we monitor your compliance with state and federal civil rights laws, both as part of CPR, which stands for Consolidated Program Review, which is our giant compliance monitoring that we do every 5 years or so in your district, and in rare instances where we actually initiate a compliance review ourselves. And for those moments when prevention doesn't have the intended effect, we also oversee a formal discrimination complaint process. So that's just a bit about our office, but we are here as a resource for you and for families, so never hesitate to reach out. We have about 2 hours today. Of that time, we have budgeted about 90 minutes to share content with you and about 30 minutes for a live question and answer at the end. So because we are recording this webinar so that we can post it onto our website so that anyone that couldn't make it today will be able to access it, we are going to ask you to hold your questions until the end if you'd like to ask a live question. During the presentation, if you have a question, type it into that Q&A box. Jeremy will either respond in line or he will let you know that he's going to hold it until the end and it will be answered during the live session. So we do want to try and make sure that we get through our content just for the purposes of those folks who are not on the recording with us today. Let's see. Here are our training objectives. So today we are trying to accomplish 3 things, right? So first we need to set the stage and understand why we focus on sex equity in athletics to begin with. We'll then move into a clarification section where we go through what an LEA, so LEA stands for Local Education Agency. That term is used to include both public schools and charter schools. So we're going to clarify LEA's obligations under federal and state law to provide equal athletic opportunities for their boys and girls. And then finally, we're going to go into the nuts and bolts of how do you do that? How do you assess your athletics program for sex equity using a tool called Title IX's 3-part test? The other piece that's going to be woven throughout all of these sections is going to be documentation and creating systems, reliable systems to use to document your work and to ensure that you are in compliance with the law. Okay, so those are our 3 training objectives for the day. So before we begin, right, focusing on sex equity, why this matters. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I was a 4-year Division I college soccer player in the Big Ten Conference. And at the risk of dating myself slightly, I began my college soccer career in the mid-90s, so about 25 years after Title IX was passed. And I very much consider myself a direct beneficiary of all of the good things that Title IX has created, right? But that said, as you can imagine, I and my teammates have certainly seen and experienced the other side of the coin as well. So it's through both of these lenses that I view Title IX, right? Both as this kind of miraculous piece of legislation that has done wonders for increasing opportunities for girls and women in sports, but also this law that's a source of untapped potential, right? So keeping those perspectives in mind as we move into a discussion of why this matters. Okay, so why do we focus on sex equity in athletics? Why all the fuss, right? We're going to talk about 3 reasons. The first is the benefits that flow from sports participation. The second is truly just to celebrate the progress we've made. And the third is just to highlight that the work isn't done yet. Okay, so let's start with the benefits, right? You are all in the field that you are in. I am assuming that most of you are athletic directors, district administrators. You are in the work you do because you know, either through personal experience or from observing it, that participation in sports can be critical for success in life outside of sports. Okay, so what am I talking about? Well, research consistently has shown that for everybody, but particularly for girls and women, there are a number of lifelong benefits that flow from having participated in sports, right? So participation in school-based athletics correlates strongly with improved physical, social, mental, and emotional health, including lower levels of depression and anxiety. They can enhance our feelings of confidence and self-esteem. They can result in higher levels of family satisfaction. I didn't know what that meant when I was looking at this study, but what it means is that the quality of your interactions with your family members, your closeness, your ability to communicate, athletes report having higher levels of those qualities. Importantly, in an educational context, participating in sports can also result in greater academic and professional success. Now, academically, this means things like higher grades and greater aspirations to attend college or graduate school. It means lower rates of truancy or dropping out or being involved in disciplinary incidents at school. Professionally speaking, when I was looking for data to include to share with you today, I came across a study that was done by Ernst & Young in 2014 that is really frequently cited, and there's a reason. It's fascinating. They surveyed 400 women executives, and of those 400, 94% reported having competed as athletes. And among those C-suite executives, so those CEOs, the CFOs, the COOs, over half competed collegiately in athletics, right? So it seems that there's this correlation between these life skills that we gain from participating in athletics that really propel us into post-secondary success, right? We're talking about key life skills like leadership and resilience, communication, adaptability, collaboration, humility, teamwork, flexibility, right? So all of these key skills tie into our life and our successes both on and off the field. And so that is why we focus on sex equity in sports, because we want everybody to have access to these benefits. Okay. The second reason is the progress that has been made. And really, when we're talking about sex equity in athletics in an educational context, the starting line is 1972, right? All of you are probably very aware that we are celebrating 50 years since Title IX was enacted in 1972. And so we look at that as the starting point for kind of this exponential progress in the United States for girls and women in sports. Now, we focus on girls and women not to ignore the progress that boys and men have made, because there have absolutely been gains for boys and men in many of these same areas that we'll be discussing along the way, but really focusing on women and girls because historically they have been the ones who've been excluded and underrepresented in athletics. Okay. So the first place that we have to talk about is just participation rates, right? Girls' participation in sports has just skyrocketed since 1972. Pre-Title IX, only 1 in 27 girls played sports at all. Now that number is 2 out of every 5 girls. High school participation rates have grown by over 1,000%. Right? Girls now have 3 million more high school sport opportunities than they did before Title IX. College participation rates have also grown, although not quite as much, still pretty high by 614%. So women now make up 44% of all NCAA athletes as opposed to 15% pre-Title IX. Those skyrocketing participation rates is huge progress. We've also, in the last 50 years, seen more opportunities emerge for girls and women to turn sports into a profession, right? Not just as players, but as coaches, as owners, in the media, right? And while there are still a number of professional female athletes who are still going overseas to compete, more and more are staying home. I don't know how many of you caught the recent friendly soccer match between the US women's national team and England 2 weeks ago. It was the first time, incidentally, that Wembley Stadium had sold out for a women's soccer match, 77,000 fans. It's pretty awesome. Only one of the US athletes on the field competes overseas with their primary team. Everybody else stays home and plays in the NWSL, which is the US Professional Women's League, right? That would not have been true even 10 years ago, okay? We also have seen an uptick in high-profile ex-professional female athlete owners, right? If those of you who follow the soccer world, Angel City FC is a new expansion team in the NWSL. Owners include Serena Williams, Mia Hamm, Abby Wambach, Julie Foudy, right? Big names. We also see better representation, more professional opportunities in the media. My former college teammate, Lisa Byington, who started off her post-grad school journalism career as a journalist in Alpena, Michigan for $14,000 a year, has become the first female play-by-play to call a Big Ten football game. She's also just last year was named the first full-time play-by-play for the Milwaukee Bucks, the first woman to earn that position for a major men's pro sports team, right? So these are progresses and accomplishments that need to be celebrated. We also can acknowledge that media coverage of and popular interest in girls and women's sports has increased tremendously. An example that comes to mind is the Women's College World Series, which averaged about 1.2 million viewers per game, with the championship series coming in at almost 2 million viewers per game, which is pretty exciting. So the progress that's been made certainly needs to be celebrated. It's historic, right? But we can't all gloss over the fact that there is still work to do, right? So as much growth as girls and women's sports have experienced in the last 50 years, Girls' participation rates in high school have yet to reach boys' pre-1972 levels. So what this graph is showing you is that in the 50 years after Title IX passed, girls still have fewer high school participation opportunities than boys did in 1972, right? So you can see the exponential growth, but we're still behind where boys were in 1972. The same trend is true in college. Women comprise 60% of college enrollment, but only 44% of athletic participation opportunities. There's still work to do. Professional opportunities are still unequal, right? We know that professional female athletes and coaches have fewer opportunities and make significantly less than their male counterparts. I dug into this just to look at a couple of statistics, and I was really kind of blown away. So looking at NCAA coaches, the highest paid female NCAA coach is Dawn Staley, who coaches the South Carolina women's basketball team, defending national champions. She makes $2.9 million a year. That's a healthy living. The highest paid male NCAA coach is Nick Saban, Alabama's football coach. He brings in $11.7 million, right? So a disparity there. I also looked at just salaries for professional athletes. This was intriguing. The statistic that I think jumped out the most to me was when looking at the NBA and the WNBA. So the NBA, if you are a rookie with zero experience, the minimum salary that you will earn is about $1 million. Contrast that to WNBA. The maximum salary that you can make is $228,000, right? So an NBA rookie is still making $1 million. Your Jewel Lloyds, your Breonna Stewarts, your Sue Birds are maxing out at $228,000. So we still have some work to do in terms of women's professional opportunities. Media coverage as well. Women's sports still account for less than 10% of total media coverage. Okay, so progress that's been made is outstanding, but we still have work to do if we want to ensure that our daughters, that our granddaughters, our nieces, our neighbors, our friends, girls and women that we know are truly being provided with equal participation opportunities and the opportunities to enjoy all the benefits that flow from having competed in sports. So I would like to just quickly show you like a 20-second video. I don't know if there are basketball fans out there, but during the 2022 March Madness women's basketball tournament, incidentally, last year was the first year that women got to use the moniker March Madness. Previously, that had only been used for the men's tournament. But Buick launched this media campaign called See Her Greatness. And its point was to draw attention to the lack of media coverage given to women's sports. They ran 2 or 3 of these ads. I found it very powerful, and so I wanted to share it with you. And Jeremy, let me know if the sound doesn't come through, even though I did click the button. Yes? Okay.
Who's going to be the hero tonight? 3 seconds for a national championship or overtime. Ogunbowale for the win. Ogunbowale wins the national championship for Notre Dame. Enrique does it again.
All right, so bottom line from this section, why do we focus on sex equity? Because there are these benefits that flow from it, because we've made such great progress, and because there's still work to do. All right, so we're going to move into the legal part of the presentation, and this is where we're going to clarify what the law says and expects before we move into the part about how do we actually do this in our own districts. Okay, so we focus on sex equity in sports for all those reasons we just talked about, but also it's the law that we do that. So let's figure out what the law says. So this requirement flows from Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. This is a federal law that we're all probably intimately familiar with. It prohibits sex discrimination in any program or activity that receives federal financial assistance. This law really is striking in its simplicity, but also in its breadth of coverage, right? So a very simple idea that nobody on the basis of sex should be excluded from participation in, denied the benefits of, or subjected to discrimination in public schools. And we're not talking just about athletics. It says any education program or activity, right? So we're talking about everything: admissions, how students are treated and housed, employment, sexual harassment, and yes, athletics. Where did this law come from? So it was modeled after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which, as we all know, outlawed discrimination based on race, color, and national origin, but not on sex, right? That was seen as a deal breaker, and we needed to get something through. Senator Birch Bayh from Indiana introduced Title IX in 1972. And when asked why he did that, he explained that Title IX was designed to recognize and correct that omission from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He wanted to ensure that women and girls were not continually rendered as second-class citizens. He felt the only remedy was to ensure that our federal law prohibited sex discrimination at all levels of education, focusing on education because, of course, that's a springboard towards future life success, was his view. So Title IX was passed in 1972. The first set of regulations were promulgated 3 years later in 1975, and schools were then given an additional 3 years to comply. OCR, the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, issued its first athletic guidance in 1979. And this guidance is beefy. And honestly, we still largely rely upon it. There have been a number of clarifications, but for the most part, that 1979 guidance is still holding strong today. Washington law ends up being phrased and worded very similarly to Title IX. Right? This is not unusual that state law would mirror federal law in this way. So in Washington Administrative Code, we have essentially Title IX's language, right? Nobody in Washington public schools will be excluded from participation in, denied the benefits of, or discriminated against in athletics in particular because of sex, okay? Both federal and state law, Title IX and Washington's version, also require schools to evaluate their athletics programs to ensure that they are providing equal opportunities to male and female students. Okay, so that's a big reason why we're here today, is because what you need to do in terms of evaluating your programs, it's your legal obligation. Okay. And I do want to point out one thing, which is that both the regulations and in this presentation, we're going to be talking about male and female athletes, boys and girls, men and women. And the reason for that is because sports today, for the most part, including those here in Washington, are still offered separately for boys and girls, right? So this can be challenging for some transgender and non-binary students who might not identify exclusively as male or female, but who still want to play and participate in school athletics. It can also be challenging for athletic directors and Title IX coordinators who might not be entirely sure how to accommodate trans and non-binary students and which teams they should play on, or how to include them when analyzing their programs for sex equity. Okay, so I wanted to take a moment to just clarify that in terms of which team non-binary and trans students play on, Washington law is very clear that all LEAs have to allow students to participate on the athletic team that most closely aligns with their gender identity, okay? For most transgender students, this is not a difficult decision, right? A transgender girl is likely going to want to play on the girls' teams, and a transgender boy will likely want to play on the boys' teams. For a non-binary or gender fluid student, this is a little challenging, right? Because they're going to have to pick one. They're going to have to pick the one that most closely aligns with their gender identity. The WIAA has participation rules specific to trans and non-binary students. You can get more information about that in the WIA manual, section 18.15. They have also released a new toolkit on gender inclusivity, which you can check out. It was a joint project between Gender Diversity and the WIAA, just released last year, I believe, or the year before, so still really new, some great work. When you're analyzing your athletics programs for sex equity, you're as an LEA, then you would just count the number of students participating on boys and girls teams. Okay, if you have questions about this, you can contact our office. We also have more resources on trans and non-binary students on our Creating Gender Inclusive Schools webpage, but just let us know. We're happy to walk through any of that with you. All right, we are moving into the how to do this part. So this is where we are talking about how we're going to assess our athletic programs for sex equity, okay? So we know Title IX and state law require that we provide equal opportunities for male and female students. But what does equal mean in this context, right? In the Title IX context, it means equivalent or equitable. This is key. Equal in the Title IX context does not mean identical, okay? There is nothing in Title IX that requires schools to have equal number of teams for male and female athletes, or that you offer the same sports for male and female athletes. There isn't even a requirement that you have equal dollar for dollar expenditures, right? Instead, what it requires is equivalent opportunities, benefits, and treatment for male and female and male students, okay? Girls and boys teams can be provided with different opportunities as long as their respective interests and abilities are being fully and effectively accommodated. Another way to put it is that the needs of boys and girls teams should be met to the same extent, even if the needs themselves are different. Okay, so you need to meet the needs of your boys and girls to the same extent, even if the needs themselves are different. Okay. So how do we do this, right? So under both state and federal law, we measure this by analyzing each sex's athletic program with regard to a set of components or factors. This set of components or factors is often referred to as the Title IX laundry list. Today, we are just going to be focusing on the first component, interests and abilities. Next week's webinar, Jeremy is going to take you through the rest of the laundry list. So stay tuned for that one. We're not going to cover that today. So what do we mean when we talk about interests and abilities? We're talking about whether or not the selection of sports and the levels of competition offered in a particular district at a particular school effectively accommodate the interests and abilities of both sexes. So in other words, can you as an LEA show that your boys and girls athletic programs are offering students the opportunities to compete in the sports they're interested in and capable of playing? Okay. OCR applies the three-part test to assess whether a school is providing non-discriminatory participation opportunities for individuals of both sexes. Okay, it's a three-part test, but you only need to show compliance with one part. Okay, so you need to demonstrate substantial proportionality or a history and continuing practice of program expansion for the underrepresented sex, or full and effective accommodation of the underrepresented sex's interests and abilities. Okay, it's flexible. The purpose behind the three-part test was not to box schools in and limit them and force them into one way of complying, but to instead give them three different ways, very different ways actually, to show compliance. Okay, we're going to walk through each of these parts, but first just want to emphasize that documentation here is going to be key, right? If you can't show your work, how you arrived at a conclusion, you can't show compliance. Just like in algebra class or calculus class, where if you gave an answer but didn't show your work, you probably didn't get credit for that problem. Same principle, right? The system that you use and the work that you do should be saved in such a way that it can be referenced as necessary. So think of it this way. If you as athletic director were to retire and just go and live in Hawaii right tomorrow, your system that you've used to analyze your programs for sex equity should be saved in a way that your replacement could A, access it, know where to find it and access it, and B, understand the decisions you've made, what decisions you've made and how you got to those decisions, the rationale behind them. Okay, just to illustrate this point, I worked with a district during consolidated program review this past year. I was a brand new athletic director, not new to the district, but new in that role. And when it came time for them to submit their athletics documentation, they couldn't find it. they knew that it had been done because they had actually helped complete the paperwork, but it was nowhere to be found, right? So what they ended up having to do was redo the work that they had just done the year before. So yes, after this happened and after it was all over, that AD acknowledged that yes, it was a good learning experience, but probably wasn't the most efficient use of their time, nor was it a stress-free experience. Okay, so want to make sure that your systems are replicable, easy to understand, and that you're saving them. Okay. This is a good point to also talk about something we often get asked, which is, well, how are schools in Washington doing? Like, how many schools in Washington are in compliance with Title IX? Great question. Unfortunately, we don't have accurate statistics for that. Our office does not collect that information from every school in the state from year to year. We just don't. We do monitor a select number of districts each year for compliance with Title IX. From that work, we do know that the athletic items tend to be some of the top non-compliant items, okay? We don't believe this is happening because Washington schools are persistently providing unequal opportunities to everybody. What we think is happening instead is that districts simply don't have systems in place to ensure that they're offering equal opportunities and to document their compliance from year to year. Okay, so that's really why we offer this training and why we focus on this is because we want to help you put systems in place that can reliably tell you if you're in compliance and if not, how to take proper corrective action. Okay, so how do you document the work you do then? Well, we've thought about this and we have put some time and energy into creating a set of tools that you can use. I want to run through those really quickly. So these are optional. I want to stress that unless you're going through CPR, in which case they are required. And I've divided them out into the elements from the laundry list. So today we're focusing just on interest and ability. So that's why it's giant green box. The rest of the laundry list, Jeremy is going to cover next week. He's going to talk to you about annual athletic evaluation forms and that whole process. We're not going to be touching that today. Today, what we're going to be talking about are 3 tools that you can use to help show that you're providing equal athletic opportunities and you're meeting those interests and abilities of your male and female students. The first form is the athletics interest survey. The second is the athletics survey results worksheet. And the third is the athletics opportunities worksheet. So I want to show you what those look like, just so if you're new, you know, and if you're experienced, it's a refresher. This is the athletics opportunities survey, or sorry, the student athletics interest survey. See, these names are very confusing. The student athletic interest survey. This is a survey that you administer at least once every 3 years in your district in every school that you have that offers interscholastic sports. This survey helps you determine student interest in specific sports so that you can identify unmet interests and figure out which sports to offer. So when I say every building that offers interscholastic sports, in most districts, this is going to be in every middle school or junior high and every high school. If you're a smaller district and you have all of your grades in one building, like grades K through 12 in one building or grades 6 through 12 in one building, you still want to give separate surveys to your middle school students and surveys to your high school students, assuming they compete at different levels. So assuming your middle schoolers compete against other middle schoolers and your high schoolers compete against other high schoolers. Some schools also survey their incoming class and skip their graduating class. So for example, if you're a middle school, you might not survey your 8th graders because they're leaving anyway, right? But you might survey your incoming 6th graders. So you're now 5th graders to see what sports they're interested in participating in. Same principle for high school, okay? You do have to use OSPI's survey. Any modifications to this survey have to be approved in advance by our office. And the reason for that is because there are very specific questions that have to be asked and things that have to be included. And we want you to be able to rely on your survey. And if you modify it, you may learn that you can't actually use it and you have to redo it. And that would be unfortunate. Trying to think, there's something else I was going to mention about that. I can't remember. It'll come to me, I'm sure. You can absolutely adapt it for online use. Some districts are very savvy and have used a QR code to link students directly to an online version. We have instructions on our website for how you can make this survey turn it into an online survey. So you're welcome to do that. The results of the survey are going to eventually be used for your Part 3 analysis. Don't worry about that now. We'll talk about it later. Okay, so the survey is there. Oh, I know what I was going to say about it is that we updated it in 2018. So if you haven't given your survey since 2018, you want to make sure that you're giving the latest version, which is available on our website. Okay, so that's the survey. And we'll come back to it throughout the presentation, but that's just an overview. The second form that I think is critical, it is optional, but we developed this form because when we were looking at districts through CPR, we noticed that a lot of districts were not breaking their survey data down properly. And as a result, their survey data was kind of useless. So we don't want you to be in that situation. So essentially what you need to do with your survey data is first break it down by building, and then break it down by sex. So if you have middle school 1 and middle school 2 in your district, you will first break it out so you have all the answers from students from middle school 1, and you'll know how boys from that school answered every question and how girls from that school answered every question. Same for middle school 2, high school 1, high school 2. If you use this form, it will force you to break the data down in the right way. Okay, so we just think it's easier to use it. It can be more efficient than trying to figure out how to do it properly. So this will ensure that you break it down the right way. It will also help you more easily identify the top sports that are requested and the top reasons why students aren't participating in sports for each sex, something that you'll also need for your analysis. And you'll use these results to complete your Part 3 analysis. Okay. Again, totally optional, but really helpful. The final tool that we've created to help you is called the Athletics Opportunities Worksheet. And this is a self-evaluation tool, again, optional, based on the 3-part test. And I say optional unless you're going through CPR. It's required at that point. We have designed it so that it has one section corresponding with each part of the test. So Part 1 on our worksheet corresponds with Part 1 of the 3-part test. Part 2 corresponds with Part 2 of the 3-part test, and so on and so forth. Okay. Essentially what this is, it's an Excel workbook with tabs at the bottom. The first tab, you will find instructions, how to fill it out, what data you'll need to collect in order to fill it out. How do I do this? That's in the first tab. The next tabs will give you an athletic opportunities worksheet for up to 10 schools, 1 school per tab. Okay. Why schools and not district? Because you're going to be looking at this from a building level perspective. Okay. Larger districts, you can use several different workbooks to account for all your schools. Smaller districts, you're probably not going to need to use all the tabs at the bottom. Okay. Required for CPR, available on our website. So those are the tools: the survey, the results summary worksheet, and the athletic opportunities worksheet. All right, so just as a refresher, this is Title IX's 3-part test. We are ready to dig in. Let's start with Part 1. So Part 1 is called substantial proportionality. And here you can meet compliance if you're able to show that your athletic participation opportunities for male and female students are provided in numbers that are substantially proportionate to their respective enrollments in the school. Okay. So in order to make this comparison, you need to know some information. You need to know how many students are enrolled in your school and how many of them are boys and girls. But you also need to know how to count a participation opportunity. What sports can be counted for purposes of Part 1? And how do we measure substantial proportionality? So those are the things that we're going to cover. Participation opportunities, okay? Each spot that one of your student athletes occupies on an interscholastic sports team at a school counts once as one participation opportunity. Okay, that word interscholastic is key. We're not counting intramural, we're not counting club participants, we're counting only kids that are playing on your official school teams, varsity, JV, JV2, however many different levels you have, okay? Well, when do we do this count, right? Because rosters can fluctuate throughout the season. There isn't a set rule, except there sort of is. OCR has said that you should do your count. Whoever's on your roster as of the date of the first competition for each sport, that's your roster. That's when you're going to count your participation opportunities. Okay, so who's ever on your roster as of the date of the first competition, those are the kids that count. Okay, so let's just do an example just to test our understanding. So here we have Taylor. Taylor played volleyball and basketball, and she also tried tennis, but she quit before the first match. So how many girls' athletic participation opportunities did Taylor occupy? Well, volleyball is 1, basketball is 2, tennis. Well, she was on the tennis team. Oh, wait, but she quit before the first match. We don't count her for tennis. Should we count Taylor for 2 participation opportunities? Okay, had Taylor quit the day after the first tennis match, we would have counted her, but she didn't. Okay, so look at your rosters as of the date of your first competition in that sport. Okay, that's how you're counting participation opportunities. Now, part 1 hinges on counting the participation opportunities offered to each sex in the school's athletic program, but those participation opportunities have to take place in the context of a sport, quote unquote, a sport. So what on earth is a sport for purposes of part 1? Well, there isn't a set definition, unfortunately, that we can share with you. What OCR has done instead is it has outlined in this 2008 guidance in inordinate detail a list of factors that tells you what it will look at when it's making a case-by-case determination about an activity. Those factors are related to the activity's structure, administration, team preparation, and competition. Okay, so that's kind of abstract, right? So here's an example. When OCR is looking at team preparation and competition, for example, some of the factors it's going to look at are whether or not the school is offering those student athletes practice opportunities. The number, the length, and quality. Are those available in a manner consistent with the already established sports in their athletics program? What about the regular season competitive opportunities? Are those offered, do they differ quantitatively or qualitatively from those offered to other established sports? Okay, so we're looking at this list of factors and basically comparing the emerging sport or activity to how the district is already running its established programs. And if that activity checks all those boxes, OCR would determine that it would be, in fact, a sport. Okay. So what do we do with this? Well, we're not going to necessarily assume something is a sport. We can't necessarily forecast the outcome, what OCR would determine. If you're unsure of whether an activity you're offering could be counted, you could work with OCR to figure that out. There is a presumption that is outlined in this guidance that says if a sport is organized as a sport and not as an activity through a state high school athletic association, and it is run in a manner consistent with that whole list of factors, it's probably a sport. Okay, so that presumption, though, can be rebutted by evidence that the sport's not actually being run in a way that satisfies those factors. Okay, so we can't make assumptions, right? There is this presumption that if the sport is organized as a sport, it's run by a state, high school athletic association, and it meets all those factors as a sport, that presumption can be rebutted. So it's not absolute. But still, if you have questions about something, you can contact us or OCR. All right, let's test this out here. So we have unified sports. So unified sports are opportunities where we have students with and without disabilities competing on the same team. Can a school count those for purposes of part 1? What do you think? Yes, not recommended, or it depends? Yeah, so it's going to depend, right? What's it going to depend on? It's going to depend on whether or not it satisfies that list of factors. Okay, so if you have an emerging sport, one that comes to mind is esports, right? That's something that I know a lot of colleges have started to add to their athletics offerings. However, I don't know that a determination has been made by OCR that it's a sport. I don't know how esports would align with all those factors, but that's the analysis that you would have to go through. let's talk about cheer and dance, right? Can we count cheer and dance for purposes of part 1? Do those participants count as participation opportunities? And is our cheer and dance considered sports under part 1? We do not recommend that you count cheer or dance for purposes of part 1 unless you have sought and obtained prior approval from OCR. Okay. OCR has repeatedly indicated that it starts its Title IX analysis with the presumption that cheer, dance, and drill are not quote unquote sports. They don't meet that definition. They don't tick off all those check boxes of factors. And so you should not be counting your participants as athletic participation opportunities. Now, OCR has indicated it would make determinations allowing schools to include cheer, dance, or drill on a case-by-case basis, but to date, we are unaware of OCR having actually made that determination for any interscholastic program anywhere in the United States. Okay. I do want to point out that this could be shifting. Okay, there's some momentum. There is a new emerging sport called acrobatics and tumbling that was recently recognized by the NCAA at the intercollegiate level as an emerging sport. Right now, there are about 12 colleges and universities with teams involved in the NCAA competition in this sport. At this point, this does not impact interscholastic cheerleading and dance, but it does perhaps indicate that maybe something similar could happen down the road at the high school level, but we're just not there yet, okay? In your handout, oh, I should have mentioned this, your handout and a PDF of the slide deck are available in PD Enroller for you to download, okay, if you don't have copies of those. In your handout, there's also a footnote when we talk about cheer and dance. There's a court case out of Massachusetts called Biediger versus Quinnipiac University. And it goes through OCR's analysis with regard to cheer and dance. If you're interested in kind of understanding more about what OCR looked at and the factors that it considered, great case to read, and that section's not too long in the case. I do anticipate we'll have questions of clarification about this, so I would encourage you to just put those in the Q&A and we will address those at the end of the presentation. All right, the million-dollar question, now that we know how to count athletic participation opportunities and we know what counts as a sport, what is meant by substantial proportionality? Okay, well, let's actually talk about what it is not first, because that's a lot easier to talk about. So substantial proportionality is not exact proportionality. Okay, exact proportionality would be this situation. You have a high school where 50% of your student body is male and 50% is female. If you were to have an athletics program that was exactly proportionate with that, 50% of your athletic participation opportunities would be taken up by boys and 50% with girls. Okay, OCR Title IX does not require that. Okay, and you know, I was kind of curious, why is that? Like, why wouldn't we want exact proportionality, right? Like that would mean that we've actually done it. Like we have achieved sex equity in our athletic programs. And OCR says yes, and that's really unreasonable, because school populations can fluctuate so much from year to year, honestly, sometimes from week to week. Interest in sports can fluctuate from year to year. And so OCR decided to offer you some wiggle room by saying all you need to do is show substantial proportionality. But how close to exact proportionality do we need to be? Like how close is close enough? And I wish I could give you a set measure, right? I wish I could say that if you fall within 2% of your exact proportionality on either side, that you're in a safe harbor and you're okay. I can't tell you that. OCR says that it's an individualized determination. It's really school specific. There is guidance from 1996 that I'm going to share with you, and this is how OCR defines substantial proportionality. So OCR says that you've achieved that substantial proportionality when the number of opportunities that would be required to achieve exact proportionality wouldn't be sufficient to sustain a viable team. And a viable team is one where you have enough interested and able kids and enough competition to sustain a team. Okay, I've read that definition over and over and over, and I feel like every time I read it, it gets more confusing, right? Especially when you add this wrinkle to it, which is that in the sentence immediately after this, in the 1996 guidance, OCR says, by the way, as a frame of reference, you can use average team size as a proxy for viable team size. So in other words, if you needed 24 additional opportunities for boys to reach exact proportionality, if that number 24 is larger than your average team size for boys, then you probably can't meet compliance, right? So we've actually used average team size as a proxy for years. We built our athletic opportunities worksheet around it. Those of you who filled out our worksheet before, you know that if you put in your numbers, it's going to turn out an average team size and it will auto-populate and tell you how far off you are. Wrinkle is this. We learned last month that OCR is departing from average team size as a measure. They are instead going back and going to rely on viable team size, which I guess is something they've always done. Like the average team size was just a frame of reference, but now they're saying probably shouldn't be using it. So when we learned this, we reached out to them to say, hey, we're going to be training a ton of athletic directors in about 2 weeks. Can you share any clarification about what do we tell them, right? Because this is going to be a little bit of a shift. And they pointed us back to this guidance, this excerpt that I've pasted for you up here. Okay, so what do you do? What do you do with this information, right? How do we know if we've reached substantial proportionality? This is what we would suggest that you do practically speaking, and we'll run through an example afterwards, okay? We suggest that until we get additional clarification from OCR, which we'll push out to you as soon as we get, that you put your numbers into our athletic opportunities worksheet just like you've always done. And if you get exact proportionality, if you happen to get that, great. You've met part one. If you don't get exact proportionality or something super close, we would say, assume you didn't meet part one and let's go on and do parts 2 and 3. Okay, so that's the practical guidance we can give you. As soon as we have anything further, we will make sure to push that out through our listserv. Let's walk through an example though. Let's pretend that you're an athletic director at Equity High School. And these are your stats, right? Your enrollment is 800. 48% of those students are boys, 52% are girls. You've gone through and counted up your participation opportunities and the number of teams that you have. And just eyeballing this, it looks like we are probably not going to hit exact proportionality because if we were, those numbers would be the same, and they are not. Okay, so all right, that's okay. Let's put this into our worksheet. So this is what the athletic opportunities worksheet looks like. We're taking this information and we're plugging it into our Excel workbook. So we've inputted our numbers, our teams. It's churned out average team size, which we're going to ask you to ignore for right now. But really what I want to draw your attention to is this call out box, right? So as we already know, if we'd hit exact proportionality, those call out or those bar graphs would be the same, and they're not. And in this case, because the difference is about 8%, I don't know that an argument could be made that you're in substantial proportionality. So what's the point? What have we done? What have we learned from doing this? Well, we've learned something really important. Actually, 2 things. We learned 1, we're not going to meet under part 1 this year. Okay. But 2, we know who our underrepresented sex is. We know that girls are underrepresented in this high school this year. Okay, so we know that from this point forward, when we go on to our part 2 and part 3 analysis, we are focusing on girls. Okay, so we're going to take this information and we are going to move on to parts 2 and part 3. Okay, so that's how we suggest that you approach part 1 of the test until we get additional guidance. All right, part 2. So even when a sex is underrepresented in a school's athletic program, you can still meet compliance under part 2 if you can demonstrate that your school has a history and continuing practice of program expansion that is responsive, demonstrably responsive to the developing interests and abilities of the underrepresented sex. Okay, so part 2, you're really looking at the school's actual past and continuing efforts to provide participation opportunities through program expansion. Okay, and what we're looking for here is a record of adding new sports or expanding opportunities, so maybe adding teams in response to the existing and emerging interests of the underrepresented sex. We're looking to see if you have a clear and effective method for requesting new sports or if you're implementing a plan to add more sports in response to a known interest. So here, things that we need to think about are, hey, do we actually have a clear and effective process that students can use to request new sports? AKA the Student Athletic Interest Survey might be one such method. Looking back over the last, our worksheet asks you to look back over 5 years. Have we added new sports or expanded opportunities for the underrepresented sex in response to these documented interests? Have we cut any teams for the underrepresented sex? And are we currently implementing an approved plan to add more sports? Okay. One thing that's important to know is that a plan to expand the program sometime in the future doesn't count for purposes of Part 2. So it only counts if you have a plan, they only count the things that you've done up to that point in time. So anything that you are planning to do in the future doesn't count until it's done, okay? And I should mention here that Part 2 in this day and age is difficult for schools to meet, and this is why. If you think back to 1972, when this was enacted, most schools had 0 sports for girls and women. And so rather than expect schools to instantly, match boys, right? So let's say you had 10 sports for boys in your high school in 1972, Title IX comes around, you're expected to immediately just add 10 sports or so to your program for girls, not realistic. So OSCR said, okay, we'll do this. We will allow you to meet compliance if you can show us a plan where you are consistently expanding your program in response to interest. Maybe you're adding a team every 2 years. Maybe you're expanding the number of sports, right? So an approved plan is really sort of a vestige from those early days of Title IX, where they were giving schools an opportunity to slowly build their programs as opposed to expect them to immediately offer full-blown programs. So unless you're a brand new school, it can be challenging to meet under Part 2, but I want to make sure we're covering it anyway, just so that you're aware of what you need to look for. So first of all, we're just going to identify the unrepresented sex. We're using a different example, a different hypo. Fairness Middle School, you have 250 students, 55% are male, 45% are female. When you conduct your Part 1 analysis, you learn that boys comprise 47% of the girls' athletic participation opportunities, and girls make up the other 53%. So which sex is underrepresented? Boys, because they do not fill as many participation spots as they do enrollment spots. All right, so using this hypo, as we're thinking about whether Fairness Middle School is going to meet under Part 2, think not only about the information you have, but think about what information you might want to have, the things that you might need to know that we don't have here that you would need in order to explore Part 2 compliance. Okay, so we know that boys are underrepresented. We know that Fairness Middle School added boys tennis in 2012 and cross country for boys in 2019. They dropped JV basketball last year due to a shortage of players, and that they're thinking about adding bowling next year. Okay, so when we're looking at Part 2 compliance, right, we want to think about whether or not the school has a record of adding new sports. Do we? We do. The gap between them, 7 years, right? So if we're looking back 10 years, we've only added 2 sports. Not certain that that would be a history and continuing practice of adding, but we have added. Have we dropped any sports? Yes, we dropped JV basketball last year. And what else do we know? We're thinking about adding bowling. Okay, so what info don't we know? We don't know, most importantly, whether or not these sports that were added were done in response to boys' requests, right? We don't know if this is responsive to their interests. So we don't know if the school has given us students a survey to find out what they want to play. We don't know if they've asked boys in other ways. We don't know if they've looked to see what sports boys are playing outside of school, which could indicate an unmet interest, right? We don't know if they're implementing an approved plan of program expansion, okay? So there are these things that we don't know, but overall, the big picture here is probably that the school is not going to be able to demonstrate compliance. Like adding 2 sports in 10 years is probably not going to be sufficient. And the last bullet point, what do we do about thinking about adding bowling? It's a bit of a red herring because as we know, we don't add it into anything into the analysis until it's already happened, right? So unless they've added bowling, we're not going to count it as an added sport. Okay, so this is what it would look like on the athletics opportunities worksheet if you were translating that onto our tool. This square here, underrepresented sex, would auto-populate based on how you filled out your Part 1 analysis. And then you would type in, okay, yeah, we added tennis in 2012, cross country in 2019, we dropped JV boys basketball. The thing that our worksheet doesn't have, and I wish it did, was a little box where you could document whether or not you think you're in compliance and why or why not. We don't have a space for you to do that. So I would just encourage you to write in the margins kind of what you think and why you think that, just so that way if you're looking back later, you know kind of what conclusion you came to. Okay, so that's part 2. What happens if we don't meet part 1 or part 2? Do not fear. There is still one last part that we could still meet. And that part is part 3. And here we are looking to see that, okay, we do have an underrepresented sex, so we're not substantially proportionate. We can't show a history and continuing practice of program expansion. But maybe we can show that the sports that we're offering in our current program are the sports that our underrepresented sex is asking for and is able to play. Okay, so we can show that even though we're not meeting the other 2 parts, we're still not discriminating because we're actually fully accommodating the interests and abilities of that underrepresented sex. Okay. When you're looking and trying to determine whether or not you're doing this, there are 3 questions that we are going to keep coming back to and keep coming back to. Okay, these will not be unfamiliar to you if you are an experienced athletic director. You must consider whether there is unmet interest in a particular sport. Is there sufficient ability to sustain a team in the sport that's being requested? And is there a reasonable expectation of competition for a team? For each of these questions, you will want to document whether the answer is yes or no, and then explain how you know. These 3 questions together are often referred to as the feasibility analysis, because if it's feasible to offer the requested sport, i.e., if the answer to each of these questions is yes, and the school hasn't taken steps to do that, then it's likely that you're not in compliance with Part 3 because you're not fully and effectively accommodating the interests and abilities of the underrepresented sex. Okay, so kind of bookmark this phrase in your head, feasibility analysis. We're going to come back to it in a few minutes. But first, I just want to go through and clarify what each of these bolded terms mean. So when you're trying to figure out how to identify any unmet interests, so you're trying to figure out, does your current program fully and effectively accommodate, are we offering the sports that our underrepresented sex is interested in? Well, we need to know if they have any unmet interests. How do we find that out? We look at our responses to the Student Athletic Interest Survey and any other requests for sports or information the school has. Okay, so first we need to know what sports the underrepresented sex is asking for. Do we already offer them? Are students participating in other sports elsewhere? And could we explore the idea of offering non-WIAA sports? Okay, so schools aren't limited to offering sports sanctioned by WIAA, provided that the sport that's offered aligns with the factors that OCR considers when they're analyzing whether or not an activity is a sport. Some non-WIAA sports that come to mind, badminton, rugby, ultimate, right? There can be interest in these activities and there can be informal competition that's organized to kind of gauge interest and unmet interest. So those are things we're considering. We're going to use our survey and our survey results summary to figure out if we have any unmet interests. Okay, we'll go through an example here in a little bit. Sufficient abilities to sustain a team. So here we're going to be evaluating whether or not there are enough members of the underrepresented sex that would turn out for the sport and whether they have the skills or experience needed to compete. So we're thinking about, okay, if we were to offer this sport, are there enough interested kids that we'd be able to field a team? And obviously this number is really sport dependent, right? Like you need different numbers of kids to field a softball team versus a tennis team, right? So you want to consider whether or not for that sport that's being requested, you have enough players to field a starting lineup. How big are the other teams in your conference? How many subs do you actually need? And how many athletes should you have to run an effective practice? And thinking about those questions should lead you to whether or not you have enough kids to field a team. The second question is whether or not kids have the athletic abilities they need to compete. And here we're thinking about whether students use any similar skill sets in other sports, or maybe they play that sport in PE class or in club or intramural. And here we are not looking for kids to be professional in their athletic ability. You're just holding them to the same standard that you're holding all the other athletes to. So if you have tryouts for your other sports, you can still have tryouts for this sport. But so kids don't have to have, requisite skill set necessarily if that's how you treat other sports as well. With reasonable expectation of competition, you're going to be looking at whether or not there's anybody for a team or a sport to play in your geographic region, in the geographic region where you typically compete. So you are going to think about your current opponents in your league, and then any other schools in that same region that you don't currently compete against, with the caveat that you don't have to compete outside your classification. So if you're a 2A school, you're not going to be asked to go find opponents in 4A or 3A or underneath or below you, right? In 1A or 2B or 1B. Okay, so you don't have to go outside your classification. If there aren't other schools that you can play against in interscholastic competition, is there the potential to develop additional competition in that sport, even if you're not starting off with interscholastic level? So this could be talking with your fellow ADs and learning, hey, like everybody in our league actually does have a lot of kids interested in badminton. Maybe we should put together a jamboree or an informal intramural or club league for badminton to kind of gauge interest and kind of test it out and see if there's a possibility of, generating enough interest that we could potentially elevate that to interscholastic at some point, right? So thinking about it in that perspective too. And when you're thinking about your geographic area, the reasonableness standard comes into play. So how far do your existing sports teams regularly travel for competition, right? If you're a school that is relatively isolated and you're continually busing your kids at least an hour away for competition, then that's kind of the parameters that you'd be looking for here too. If your kids are asking for bowling and you're an isolated school and the nearest, competition is going to be 2 hours away, that's twice as far as you already take kids, right? That might not be reasonable in that context. So make sure you're applying that reasonableness lens. Okay, let's look at how this might look on the athletic opportunities worksheet, because this is the most complicated part. Here's a blank worksheet. So here we're looking at underrepresented sex. We also ask you to put in the date that you last gave your survey, just so we can make sure you're offering it within 3 years. And then the number of kids that responded to the survey. And I should note here that there isn't a minimum response rate that you need, but OCR does give more weight the more responses you have, right? It's just kind of a data reliability consideration. In this first column, it says sports requested by the underrepresented sex. This is where you're going to put your top requested sports by the underrepresented sex. You're going to say whether or not the sport was added as a result, yes or no, and if not, why. And here in that big box, a prompt says, how did the district determine the feasibility of offering this sport? Feasibility. Where have I heard that term before? Keep that in mind. So let's go through an example. Let's go back to Equity High School just because we have this data kind of all neatly tied up. Just a refresher, here's our athletic program. Well, how do we know what our top requested sports are? Let's go to our survey. Remember, we're focusing on girls, and we're going to count up how many girls asked for all of these different sports. And just for context, the question right before this on the survey is, do you participate in sports at your school? Yes or no? And if not, which sports are you most interested? Would you be most interested in participating in? Okay. So it can help. I'm a visual person, so I found it was helpful to bold the top 5 requested sports and to put like a little ranking next to them in parentheses. So from the survey, we know that volleyball was the top requested sports. We had 50 students interested. Swimming and diving was second with 49, gymnastics third with 45. We had a tie with soccer and track at 43 and basketball 33. So transferring those results to the athletic opportunities worksheet, volleyball is the top requested. It goes in this first box. Swim and dive was second. It goes here. Gymnastics, soccer, and track. And there would be a 5th one, but I just didn't have room. So now we're going to go through and analyze whether or not it's feasible to offer these sports that were the most requested by our underrepresented sex. Okay, so the first question we're going to say is, okay, did we add this sport as a result? Yes or no? If yes, you're done. If no, we have to go a step further and explain why we didn't add it. Okay, this is the box that tends to give people the most problems because they're not sure what to put in it. This is what, at a minimum, we want to see in that box. So at a minimum, we want to see you're going through the feasibility analysis, yes or no to each question and explaining how you know. Okay. Now, in case you've forgotten what the feasibility analysis was, here it is. So for each of these sports, in each of these big boxes, you're going to be answering each of these questions, yes or no, and explaining how you know. Okay, so let's think about this. Let's work through just one example. Let's work through volleyball because that was our top requested sport. Okay, so the first question in the feasibility analysis was, is there an unmet interest? Yes or no? Well, I think we can answer this one pretty confidently. Yes, it was the top requested sport in the survey. We saw that 50 girls were interested in participating. How else might we know? Well, maybe students are bugging you during your office hours to add a volleyball program. Maybe your PE classes in volleyball fill up super fast. Maybe you know there's a really robust volleyball club league that's happening in your community, right? This can all indicate unmet interest. So you would say yes and explain how you know. The next question, is there sufficient ability to sustain a team in volleyball? Yes, no, how do you know? Well, is there a sufficient number of athletes to field a team? Well, 50 kids said they're interested. So that's probably more than enough for one team. It's probably like, I don't know, 4 teams, right? So do the athletes have the skills and abilities to compete? Well, that's what you need to analyze, right? So you need to figure out if, they have the athleticism that they would need to compete held to the same standard that you hold other athletes in your sports program to already. So yes, no, how do you know? Reasonable expectation of competition. Yes, no, how do you know? Are there other schools in your normal competitive area that you could play against? Here's where the number of kids interested plays in, right? You had 50 girls interested. If you were to add 4 more volleyball teams, would there be enough competition? Would there be anybody for them to play? That's a little tricky, right? What if you were to add 1 more team or 2 more teams, right? So playing with that a little bit based on your numbers, that's going to help you figure out your competition. And if not, like maybe there is only competition for 1 additional volleyball team. Okay, what do we do with the rest of those 50 girls, right? Well, maybe we work with neighboring schools to figure out if there are other interested kids that want to put together a jamboree or a club league or something, right? Doing something to obtain competition for kids, even if it's not to the level of interscholastic yet, is better than doing nothing, right? And so you'd include all those efforts into your description. So what are we looking for in this box? We're looking for a narrative paragraph where you're going through the feasibility analysis. You're answering whether or not you have unmet interest. Yes, no, how do you know? Sufficient ability to field a team. Yes, no, how do you know? Reasonable expectation of competition. Yes, no, how do you know? If the answer to all of those questions is yes, then it's probably feasible to add a team or a sport, and you should take steps towards that end. Okay. So things that we don't want to see in this box, nothing. We want to see that you've put something in there. Sometimes we will see that districts put, was the sport added? No, but then there's no explanation in this box. And that leaves us kind of scratching our head and thinking, well, I wonder what happened. Like, did they explore it all, or what steps did they take? So show your work, right? And let us know what steps you've explored to kind of flesh out the feasibility of offering that sport. Okay. The other thing that we will say that we see that is unfortunately not an acceptable answer is we don't have the money and we don't have the facilities, right? So in general, those are not defenses for not adding something. And we'll go into that in the next section, which is frequently asked questions, but we need to see more analysis than that. We need to see the feasibility analysis. And then if you want to talk about resources and facilities, you can, but we have to see the feasibility analysis first. Okay. All right, let's move into frequently asked questions, and then we'll jump into the live Q&A. All right, what if when we're doing this, all the top requested sports we already offer? What do we do? Let's look at an example. So here at Parity Middle School, boys are underrepresented, and according to the survey, they want basketball and they want swimming. But you already offer 2 basketball teams and a swim team. What are you supposed to do? Well, you want to go through the feasibility analysis for each sport. Unmet interest, yes, no, how do you know? Sufficient ability to sustain a team, reasonable expectation of competition. If the answer to any of those questions is no, you wouldn't need to add an additional team, but you'd want to show your work, okay? So that is how you would approach that. We want to also issue a word of caution about something called over-rostering, which is where, let's say, let's take swimming here. You've got 10 kids that wanted to add a swimming team. Let's say that you don't quite have enough for 2 swim teams. So you're like, oh, we'll just add these kids to the one swim team. We'll just have a giant swim team. Well, you need to make sure that your athletic experience for those students is equivalent to the experience that other athletes are getting. Okay, so if you have a giant team where kids aren't getting the type of coaching exposure that you would have if you played a different sport, if they're not getting necessarily the practice or the game experience that they would get in another sport, that's not an equivalent experience. And so we want to be really careful about over rostering, okay, because it can mean a lesser experience for those athletes. What if we don't have the money to add a sport? Okay, this is probably something that sounds really familiar in this day and age. And in general, the general rule is that a lack of funding is not a justifiable reason for unequal treatment. Okay, Title IX actually specifically addresses this in the regulations. I'm not going to read you the quote from the regulations because it's super legalese, but I'm going to paraphrase it for you. And it basically says that nothing in Title IX says that funding has to be identical for boys and girls programs or boys and girls teams in the same sports. However, when determining if equal opportunity has been provided, OCR can and probably will notice if a district is failing or has failed to adequately fund one sex's programs or teams. So if an underrepresented sex has persistently been asking for a certain sport for a period of time, and the district hasn't added it but has spent money on something else, that might not be the best optics if OCR were to come in and look at your program. Okay, so schools aren't absolved of their Title IX responsibilities, even if coaches and administrators make inequitable choices about how to spend the money they have. And to be clear, we are not talking about outside sources of funding here. We're not talking about fundraisers or booster clubs or donations. Jeremy is going to spend quite a large amount of time talking about that next week. We're talking just about the district's own athletic budget. And if a complaint were to come in to us or to you about inequitable athletics funding, it's very likely they would request your budget to figure out how athletics money is being spent. And again, the key here is not that you're spending the exact same amount on boys and girls programs or boys and girls athletes, but that you're providing equal opportunities. And if the underrepresented sex has requested a sport and it's feasible to offer it, it should be offered and the school has to find a way or risk being out of compliance, okay? This falls into the category of school officials have to make a lot of really tough choices, among them whether or not to offer a sports program at all, which sports to offer, whether to spend money on these facilities or that facilities. Those choices have to be made with Title IX and with sex equity in mind. That's just the rule, okay? This question also pops up, right? We often hear that students are really interested in swimming or gymnastics or bowling or some other sport that requires a facility that the school just doesn't have. And generally speaking, under Title IX, just like the funding, a facilities issue isn't an acceptable justification for not offering a team if the feasibility analysis indicates it should be added. Okay, so OCR would say, hey, there might be situations where you'd have to build a new facility or renovate an existing facility or identify an appropriate facility off campus. 2 exceptions to that are going to be rowing and skiing. You're not going to have to add a body of water or a mountain to your campus. So you're off the hook there. When determining if a school should build or renovate a facility, OCR will consider the costs that the district has recently incurred to build or renovate facilities for other sports, right? So things to think about. We're not going to go too deep into this about new construction or renovation in this training, that's kind of an offline topic just because it gets really fact specific. So call us if you have that question. I do want to look at a more common scenario, which is using community facilities. So let's pretend we're at Equity High School again, and the girls are asking for bowling. And the athletic director did their due diligence. They're like, yeah, it's actually feasible to offer this. Like we can do this. There's people to play. We've got enough kids to fill the team. It's an unmet interest. We can do this. Wait a minute. We don't have a bowling alley. Oh, but there's one in town. We could totally use that one. Ah, it's a 15-minute drive away. What do we do? Okay, so things to consider. Distance away from school, right? Both in terms of actual mileage and also travel time. Because as we all know, in a big city, it can take a lot longer to go 2 miles than it can take to drive 10 miles in not a big city, right? So distance and travel time. How are kids get there? Would they drive themselves? Would they be bused? Would they take a van? Are there locker rooms available? What's the quality of the facility as compared to on-campus facilities used by other athletes in other sports? Does the school currently transport other students to off-campus facilities for practices or competitions, right? So these are all things that you'd want to consider when you're using an off-campus facility. And in this situation, if your bowling alley has availability and it's only 15 minutes away, I think that's an awesome solution. So anyway, facilities. This is a myth that we hear too, or a question we get. Does Title IX require us to cut boys teams? And the answer is no. Nothing in Title IX requires a school to cut or reduce teams at all to demonstrate compliance with a 3-part test. OCR is actually actively discourages this practice. They have said it's contrary to the spirit of Title IX because it's actually diminishing opportunities for students who are interested in playing rather than enhancing opportunities for students who have experienced discrimination. So could a school decide to cut a team or squad? Yes, but nothing in Title IX requires it. This is probably another one of those decisions where it's like school officials have to make really tough calls category. And if you do have to cut back, the same principles apply, right? If the district is already providing equivalent programs to males and females, the district should make reductions that affect males and females in an equivalent way, right? So following the principle of comparable opportunities, not necessarily comparable cost. All right, we also have heard this, although we hear this less frequently now. What if the girls in our district just aren't interested in sports? And in most cases, this just really isn't true. We can see by looking at this graph again that it was a lack of opportunity, not necessarily a lack of interest that prevented females, that kept them out of sports for so many years, right? Now, there may be situations where the girls in your district aren't necessarily interested in competing in the sports you're offering. Let's go back to cheerleading for an example. Maybe the girls are in the fall are not playing soccer, are not running cross country because they're really into cheerleading. And no matter what sports you offered in the fall, they're still going to do cheer, right? That could be whatever. If that is your decision, you need to back that up with data, right? So we're going to ask, how do you know? Like, how do you know that they're not interested? Oh, well, we looked at our survey, we had an info session, we've talked to kids. If you can back up your conclusion with your data and trend data, then that's probably going to be okay. But we really need to focus on not making assumptions and focus instead on what the data is telling us. Okay, so as long as you've got the data to back it up, that's probably okay, but let's not make assumptions. Okay, we're almost to the question part, and we're just going to talk about the key takeaways, which are that you only have to comply with one part of the 3-part test. You got to develop systems that help you document from year to year, ensure that your decisions and conclusions are backed up by evidence, and just keep documenting, okay? I'm only going to touch on one thing about complaints just because this is all really, as athletic directors, you need to know at the moment, which is that if you receive a complaint about sex equity in your school's athletic programs, notify your civil rights or Title IX compliance coordinator, right? And this can happen, you should be doing this if you get a complaint in writing, right? Email, a letter, somebody hands you something, or if you get a phone call, right? If you get a phone call, someone leaves you a voicemail about something, or if you're attending an athletic event and you see or hear something that could indicate potential discrimination, tell your coordinator. The reason this is so important is that there are certain timelines involved in resolving formal complaints, and we want to make sure that you're not sitting on something for a couple of weeks and eating into that 30-day timeline, right? And then limiting the coordinator's ability to investigate. Okay, so if you hear something, if you get a complaint, just make sure your coordinator knows. If you don't know who your coordinator is, we have a way for you to look. Go to our website and you can search by district. And if you look there and you're like, ooh, this is wildly outdated, you can update it. Okay, or you can call us and we'll help you do that. We have resources on discrimination complaints. And that's it for the prepared part. Contact us with questions. I'm going to stop talking and let Jeremy weigh in with any questions that are burning at the moment.
Thank you, Kasha. So we had a follow-up on the cheerleading of have some concerns about telling athletes and their parents that cheerleading is not a sport. I was wondering if you could talk some more about that.
Absolutely. So we're not talking about the plain English definition of a sport. Like, we all know that what cheerleaders do is incredibly athletic. What we're talking about is solely for Title IX purposes. You're just not going to count them as athletic participation opportunities. If you'll look at the WIA website too, like, cheerleading is as an activity. So it's not listed as a sport on their website either, and probably for those same reasons that OCR hasn't yet found it to be a quote unquote sport for Title IX purposes. It's not a judgment. It's not saying that what they do is not athletic. It's just purely for purposes of Part 1.
All right. And then another question we had was, and I'll just read it to you. The survey was given to our students last year, but the principal here last year did not do anything with the data. Can we use the surveys to complete the worksheets for this year, or do we need to start all over?
Yeah, you absolutely can. That survey data is good for 3 years. So go ahead and use it. That's great that they did the work for you, and you can start planning how you're going to administer the survey in 2 years' time.
And that's all the questions we had. There was a question about getting the handout again, so that if anyone who's looking for the handout, that a link directly to the handout is included in the Q&A under the answered. If anyone was looking for another for that.
Yeah, and it's also available with a PDF of the slides in the PD Enroller wherever you registered. I uploaded both of the files there, so you should be able to access it that way as well. Gosh, I think that's the fewest amount of questions we've had. So thank you to everybody for participating. Oh, did one just fly in?
Yeah, there was one more regarding cheerleading again.
Okay.
Are you familiar with cheerleading being listed as a sport in the WIA's handbook, version 32?
You know, I don't recall which version of the handbook I looked at, no. And again, if you have questions about whether your particular cheer program could qualify as a sport, talk to OCR or look at those factors in the 2008 guidance that's linked in the slides and on our website, and go through those factors with regard to your program. And if you think you have a good argument to be made, like, maybe the test case is here in Washington. It could be you. So if you think that your program meets all those check boxes, by all means, contact OCR. And if you can get approval for that, then you're on your way. We just aren't aware of anybody having done that yet. So yeah, I'm not aware of that, but I will look into that. Thank you for making me aware of it.
All right. And we had a request for a link to the slides, so we can do that as well. One second here.
And just a thank you to everybody for giving up their lunch hour to spend with us. All right. Well, thank you, Jeremy, for manning the Q&A. Thank you, Tony, for being responsible for recording everything. And we will let y'all go and enjoy the rest of your day. And just let us know if you have questions. We're available by phone or email. Have a good afternoon.